Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different from the other pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. While her male counterparts swaggered around the flight line talking about their latest missions in F-16s and F-15s, she found herself drawn to the ugly, ungainly aircraft that everyone else seemed to avoid. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, sat in the corner of the hangar like a forgotten stepchild. The year was 1995, and women in combat roles were still a contentious topic in military circles. Sarah had fought tooth and nail just to get her pilot's wings, enduring countless hours of scrutiny, doubt, and outright hostility from instructors who believed the cockpit of a fighter jet was no place for a woman. She had proven herself capable in training exercises, but she was still relegated to transport duties and reconnaissance flights. General Robert Harrison was old-school military through and through. A Vietnam veteran who had flown countless missions in F-4 Phantoms, he represented everything traditional about the Air Force. His weathered face bore the scars of a man who had seen combat, and his steely gray eyes could cut through a subordinate's confidence with a single glance. He had never made any secret of his belief that women belonged in support roles, not in the pilot seat of combat aircraft. On that particular Tuesday morning in October, the desert air was crisp and clear, perfect flying weather. Sarah had just completed her third consecutive week of transport runs between bases, ferrying supplies and personnel in a C-130 cargo plane. It was honest work, but it wasn't what she had trained for. She had logged over 500 hours in various aircraft during her training, including some time in older fighter jets, but she had never been given the chance to prove herself in a true combat aircraft. The morning briefing was routine until General Harrison stood up at the front of the room. His presence immediately commanded attention from the 40-odd pilots, crew chiefs, and support staff gathered in the fluorescent-lit briefing room. The walls were covered with maps, weather charts, and safety notices, creating a familiar backdrop for what everyone assumed would be another standard operational update. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. "We have a situation developing in the training range. Echo Squadron's A-10 demonstration flight for the visiting congressional delegation has been scrubbed due to Captain Rodriguez coming down with food poisoning." A murmur went through the room. The demonstration flight was important for maintaining funding for the A-10 program, which had been under constant threat of budget cuts. The Warthog was not a glamorous aircraft, but it was incredibly effective at close air support missions, something that had been proven time and again in various conflicts. General Harrison's eyes scanned the room, looking for a replacement pilot. His gaze passed over several experienced A-10 pilots before landing on Sarah, who was sitting in the third row taking notes. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, but it wasn't the kind of smile that suggested warmth or encouragement. "Captain Mitchell," he called out, his voice carrying a tone that made several pilots turn to look at her. "You've been requesting more challenging assignments, haven't you?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She had indeed been requesting more challenging assignments through the proper channels, but she had never expected the general to acknowledge them publicly, let alone act on them. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the sudden attention. "Well then," General Harrison continued, his smile becoming more pronounced, "how would you like to take Rodriguez's place in the A-10 demonstration? I'm sure our congressional visitors would be interested to see our diversity in action." The way he emphasized certain words made it clear to everyone in the room that this was not meant as a genuine opportunity. This was a setup, a public humiliation designed to prove a point about women in combat roles. Several of the male pilots exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable with what was clearly happening, others barely suppressing smirks. Sarah felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her. She understood exactly what was happening. The general was offering her an opportunity that he fully expected her to decline, or if she accepted, to fail spectacularly. The A-10 was not an easy aircraft to fly. It was designed for close air support missions, requiring precision flying at low altitudes while managing complex weapon systems. It was the kind of aircraft that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The smart thing to do would be to politely decline, to find some excuse about not being current in the aircraft or needing more preparation time. That's what everyone expected her to do, and It would allow her to maintain her current position without risking public failure. But, as Sarah sat there, feeling the expectant silence stretch on, something inside her rebelled against the safe choice. "I would be honored to fly the demonstration, sir," she said, her voice clear and confident. The silence that followed her acceptance was deafening. General Harrison's smile faltered slightly, as if he hadn't quite expected her to accept so readily. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly, aware that they were about to witness either a spectacular success or an equally spectacular failure. "Excellent," the general said, recovering his composure. "The flight is scheduled for 1,400 hours. That gives you," he glanced at his watch, "approximately 4 hours to prepare. I'm sure that will be adequate for someone of your capabilities." As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out of the room, Sarah remained seated, her mind racing. For hours to prepare for a demonstration flight in an aircraft she had never actually flown. It was an impossible timeline by any reasonable standard, and everyone knew it. This was exactly what General Harrison had planned. Master Sergeant Jim Torres, the senior crew chief for A-10 operations, approached her as the room emptied. A 20-year veteran with graying temples and oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, Torres had seen plenty of good pilots come and go. He had also seen his share of political maneuvering and grandstanding. "Captain," he said quietly, "with all due respect, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah looked up at the older man, seeing genuine concern in his eyes rather than mockery. "My job, Sergeant. Or at least, trying to do my job." Torres sat down in the chair next to her, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I've been working on warthogs for 15 years. I've seen combat veterans with thousands of hours struggle with this bird. It's not like flying a transport. Everything happens faster, the weapon systems are complex, and if you make a mistake at low altitude, there's no time to recover." "Are you saying I shouldn't try?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying you need to understand what you're walking into," Torres replied. "The general isn't trying to help your career. He's trying to end it. He figures you'll either back down and look weak, or you'll accept and crash the aircraft, proving his point about women in combat roles." Sarah stood up, gathering her notes and flight gear. "Then, I guess I'll have to prove him wrong." Torres watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. If you're determined to do this, you're going to need all the help you can get. Meet me in Hangar 7 in 30 minutes. We're going to give you a crash course in warthog operations." As Sarah walked across the flight line toward her quarters to change into her flight suit, she could feel eyes following her. Word of the general's joke was already spreading through the base like wildfire. Some of the looks were sympathetic, others were curious, and a few were openly hostile. She understood that she was about to become either a symbol of progress or a cautionary tale, depending on how the next few hours played out. The weight of representation was crushing. It wasn't just her own career on the line, but potentially the careers of every woman who might want to fly combat aircraft in the future. If she failed, it would be used as evidence that women couldn't handle the pressure and complexity of combat flying. If she succeeded, it might open doors that had been closed for far too long. Her small quarters in the bachelor officer's quarters were Spartan, but functional. As she changed into her flight suit, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. At 28, she was in the best physical condition of her life, with the quick reflexes and sharp mind that had gotten her through pilot training. But she also saw the doubt in her own eyes, the fear that maybe the critics were right, that maybe she was in over her head. She thought about her father, Colonel James Mitchell, who had died in a helicopter crash when she was 16. He had always encouraged her to pursue her dreams, regardless of what others thought was appropriate for a young woman. "The only limitations that matter," he used to tell her, "are the ones you accept for yourself." 20 minutes later, Sarah walked into Hangar 7 to find Sergeant Torres waiting for her next to a gleaming A-10 Thunderbolt II. Up close, the aircraft was even more imposing than she had imagined. Nearly 17 feet tall and over 50 feet long, the Warthog was built around its massive Gu-8/A Avenger rotary cannon, a 7-barrel gun that could fire 3,900 rounds per minute of depleted uranium ammunition. "This is tail number 810965, Torres said, patting the aircraft's nose affectionately. "She's been with the squadron for 8 years, and She's never let a pilot down who treated her right. The first thing you need to understand about the Warthog is that she's not fast, she's not pretty, and she's not forgiving of mistakes. But she's tough as nails, and she'll keep flying even when other aircraft would fall out of the sky. For the next 2 hours, Torres walked Sarah through every system on the aircraft. The flight controls, which were heavier and less responsive than the modern fighters she had trained on. The weapons systems, which could carry everything from Maverick missiles to cluster bombs. The defensive systems, including chaff and flare dispensers designed to confuse incoming missiles. The key to flying the Warthog, Torres explained as they stood in the cockpit, is understanding that everything is about precision and patience. You can't muscle this bird around like an F-16. You have to work with her, anticipate her responses, and always stay ahead of the aircraft. As Sarah familiarized herself with the cockpit layout, other crew members began gathering around the hangar. Word had spread throughout the base about what was happening, and people were curious to see how this would play out. Some came to watch what they expected would be a spectacular failure. Others came to offer quiet support, and a few came because they genuinely wanted to see someone challenge the status quo. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Patterson, the squadron commander, arrived just as Sarah was completing her cockpit familiarization. Patterson was a respected pilot with over 2,000 hours in the A-10, and his opinion carried weight throughout the wing. His presence made everyone in the hangar stand a little straighter. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his tone neutral and professional. "I understand you volunteered for the demonstration flight." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, climbing down from the cockpit. Patterson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "What's your total time and type?" 0 hours, sir," Sarah admitted. "Combat experience?" "None, sir." Patterson nodded slowly, then turned to Torres. "Sergeant, what's your assessment of Captain Mitchell's preparation?" Torres glanced at Sarah, then back at his commander. "Sir, Captain Mitchell is a quick study. She understands the systems, and she's asking the right questions. But 2 hours of ground training isn't the same as flight experience." "No," Patterson agreed. "It's not." He turned back to Sarah. "Captain, I want to be clear about something. I have nothing against you personally, and I have nothing against women flying combat aircraft. But I have a responsibility to the safety of my pilots and to the integrity of this demonstration. Are you absolutely certain you're prepared to handle this aircraft in front of a congressional delegation and live television coverage?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment. This was her last chance to back down gracefully, to avoid what could be a career-ending disaster. But as she looked around the hangar at the faces watching her, she realized that backing down would also be career-ending, just in a different way. "Sir," she said, "I understand the risks and the responsibilities. I'm ready to fly this mission." Patterson nodded once. "Very well. But we're going to make one modification to the plan. Instead of a solo demonstration flight, you'll be flying as part of a 2-ship formation with Captain Stevens as your wingman. He's one of our most experienced A-10 pilots, and he'll be there to provide guidance and backup if needed." It was a compromise that gave everyone some cover. If things went wrong, Captain Stevens would be there to take over or provide assistance. If things went right, Sarah would still get the credit for a successful demonstration. As the time for the flight approached, Sarah went through her pre-flight preparations with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her throughout her training. She studied the weather reports, reviewed the demonstration profile, and went through multiple mental rehearsals of the flight sequence. The congressional delegation began arriving at the base around 1,300 hours, accompanied by local media representatives and military officials from Washington. General Harrison was in his element, playing the role of gracious host while subtly emphasizing the cutting-edge nature of the A-10 program and its importance to national defense. Sarah could see the delegation gathering on the observation deck overlooking the flight line as she completed her final pre-flight checks. Among them were 3 congressmen, 2 senators, and several Pentagon officials whose recommendations would influence the A-10 program's future funding. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As she strapped herself into the cockpit of the A-10, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The chaos and pressure of the past 4 hours seemed to fade away, replaced by the familiar routine of preparing for flight. This was what she had trained for, what she had dreamed of since she was a child watching jets fly overhead at her father's air shows. The engine start sequence went smoothly, the twin turbofan engines spooling up to life with their characteristic whine. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checks with Torres monitoring from the ground, each system responding exactly as it should. The aircraft felt solid and responsive beneath her, completely different from the transport planes she had been flying, but somehow familiar nonetheless. Warthog 11, you are cleared for taxi to runway 27, came the voice of the air traffic controller through her headset. Warthog 11, taxi to runway 27, Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. As the A-10 began to move, Sarah felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. In a few minutes, she would either prove that women belonged in combat aircraft cockpits or provide ammunition for those who argued they didn't. Either way, there would be no going back from whatever happened next. The taxiway stretched ahead of her like a pathway to destiny, and, for the first time since General Harrison had made his joke that morning, Sarah Mitchell smiled. The runway stretched out before Sarah like a concrete river leading into an uncertain future. As she positioned the A-10 at the end of the taxiway, she could see Captain Stevens in his aircraft parallel to hers, running through his own pre-flight checks. Through her canopy, she caught his eye and received a thumbs-up signal that somehow managed to convey both encouragement and concern. Stevens had pulled Sarah aside during the taxi out and given her a quick brief over the radio about formation flying procedures. Stay loose on the controls, he had advised. The Warthog will tell you what she wants to do if you listen to her. Don't fight the aircraft, work with it. His voice had carried the weight of experience, the kind that only came from hundreds of hours in the cockpit of this particular machine. The control tower crackled to life in Sarah's headset. Warthog flight. Winds are 270 at 8 knots. Visibility unlimited. You are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she advanced the throttles. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines responded with a deep rumble that she could feel through her seat and flight controls. The A-10 was not a fast aircraft by modern standards, but it was powerful and purposeful. As she released the brakes and began her takeoff roll, Sarah felt the machine come alive beneath her. The acceleration was different from anything she had experienced before. Unlike the smooth, linear power delivery of a transport aircraft, the Warthog seemed to gather itself like a predator preparing to pounce. The nose wanted to track slightly left due to engine torque, requiring constant small corrections on the rudder pedals. Through the canopy, she could see the delegation on the observation deck, their figures growing smaller as the aircraft picked up speed. At 90 knots, Sarah pulled back gently on the stick. The A-10 lifted off the runway with what could only be described as reluctant grace. This was not an aircraft that wanted to leave the Earth. It was an aircraft that was designed to operate as close to the ground as possible, hugging the terrain and delivering devastating firepower to enemy positions. As the landing gear retracted and Sarah established the aircraft in a climbing turn, she felt a surge of exhilaration unlike anything she had experienced in her flying career. The view from the A-10's cockpit was spectacular, with excellent visibility in all directions thanks to the aircraft's design. The desert landscape of Arizona spread out below her like a tactical map, perfect for the kind of low-level flying the Warthog was designed for. Warthog 11, how are you feeling up there? Stevens' voice came through the radio, professional, but with an undertone of genuine concern. Warthog 12, feeling good, Sarah replied. Aircraft is responding well, all systems normal. Outstanding. Remember, we're going to start with some basic formation work before we move into the demonstration profile. Just follow my lead and don't overthink it. The next 20 minutes were a revelation for Sarah. Formation flying in the A-10 required a completely different set of skills than anything she had learned in transport aircraft. The Warthog was stable but not particularly nimble, requiring pilots to anticipate movements well in advance. Stevens led her through a series of gentle turns and altitude changes, allowing her to get a feel for how the aircraft responded to control inputs. Back on the ground, General Harrison stood with the congressional delegation, watching the two aircraft through binoculars. His expression was carefully neutral, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw. This was not going according to plan. By now, He had expected either a radio call reporting mechanical problems or visible signs of pilot distress that would justify calling off the demonstration. General, the female pilot seems to be handling the aircraft quite well, observed Congressman William Thompson, a former Navy pilot himself who understood what he was watching. How much A-10 experience does she have? This is actually Captain Mitchell's first flight in the A-10, Harrison replied, unable to keep a slight edge out of his voice. She volunteered when our scheduled pilot became ill. Senator Patricia Hawkins, the ranking minority member on the Armed Services Committee, lowered her binoculars and looked at Harrison with surprise. You mean to tell us that you put a pilot with zero experience in this aircraft up there in front of a congressional delegation? That seems unnecessarily risky. Captain Mitchell is a qualified Air Force pilot with excellent ratings, Harrison said stiffly. I felt confident in her abilities. What he didn't say was that he had felt confident she would fail, providing him with a perfect example of why women shouldn't be in combat roles. But as he watched the two A-10s execute a perfect echelon turn over the airfield, Harrison began to realize that his plan might be backfiring. In the air, Sarah was beginning to understand why pilots who flew the A-10 spoke about it with such passion. The aircraft was honest in a way that other jets weren't. It didn't try to hide its limitations or mask pilot errors with sophisticated flight control systems. Every input mattered, every small adjustment was felt immediately, and the aircraft demanded constant attention and respect. All right, Warthog 1-1, Stevens called over the radio. Let's start the demonstration profile. We're going to begin with a low pass over the field at 500 feet, then move into some tactical maneuvering. Stay in close formation for the low pass. Then, we'll separate for individual demonstrations. Sarah acknowledged and followed Stevens as he banked toward the airfield. At 500 feet above ground level, the world looked completely different. The delegation on the observation deck was clearly visible, as were the maintenance crews on the flight line and the media personnel with their cameras. This was the moment of truth. The low pass went perfectly. Sarah maintained precise formation with Stevens as they flew directly over the runway at 300 knots, the sound of their engines creating the distinctive rumble that had earned the A-10 its Warthog nickname. From the ground, the sight was impressive, two combat aircraft in perfect formation, demonstrating the kind of precision flying that had made American air power legendary. As they pulled up and away from the field for the next phase of the demonstration, Sarah felt her confidence growing. The aircraft was responding exactly as Torres had said it would, honest and predictable as long as she treated it with respect. The flight controls were heavy compared to modern jets, but they provided excellent feedback about what the aircraft was doing. Warthog 1-1, you're cleared to separate for individual demonstration, Stevens radioed. Show them what this bird can do. Sarah banked away from Stevens and began the tactical demonstration sequence she had memorized during her preparation. The A-10 was designed for close air support, which meant operating at low altitude and slow speed while delivering precise firepower. The demonstration would showcase these capabilities without actually firing weapons. She rolled the aircraft into a steep dive toward a designated target area on the range, pulling out at the last possible moment in a simulated attack run. The G-forces pressed her into her seat as she pulled up, and she could feel the aircraft straining against the laws of physics. But the A-10 held together, just as it had been designed to do in combat situations where structural integrity could mean the difference between life and death. The next maneuver was a tight turning circle that demonstrated the aircraft's ability to loiter over a target area while providing continuous fire support. Sarah banked the A-10 into a 60-degree turn, using rudder and throttle adjustments to maintain altitude while keeping the aircraft in a tight circle. It was exactly the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. On the ground, the reaction from the delegation was becoming increasingly positive. These were people who understood aviation and military capabilities, and they could see that what they were watching was not just competent flying, but exceptional flying. The precision and smoothness of Sarah's demonstration was impressive by any standard, but it was particularly remarkable given her lack of experience in the aircraft. That young woman is flying that plane like she's been doing it for years, Senator Hawkins commented to her aide. I want to meet her after the demonstration. General Harrison, meanwhile, was watching his carefully laid trap collapse around him. Instead of providing evidence against women in combat roles, Sarah Mitchell was providing a compelling argument for exactly the opposite. With each passing minute of flawless flying, she was demonstrating that competence and skill had nothing to do with gender. Back in the air, Sarah was moving through the demonstration profile with growing confidence. The aircraft felt natural beneath her hands, responding to her inputs with the kind of precision that only came from excellent engineering and meticulous maintenance. She began to understand why A-10 pilots talked about their aircraft as if they were living creatures rather than machines. The next phase of the demonstration called for a simulated combat air patrol, showing how the A-10 could operate in contested airspace while providing close air support to ground forces. Sarah flew a series of evasive maneuvers while maintaining communication with an imaginary ground controller, demonstrating the multitasking abilities required in actual combat situations. As she rolled the aircraft through a series of defensive turns, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Off to her left, perhaps 2 miles away, she could see a civilian aircraft that appeared to be in distress. The small plane was smoking and losing altitude rapidly, clearly heading for an emergency landing in the desert. Warthog 1-2, this is 1-1. Sarah called urgently to Stevens. I have eyes on a civilian aircraft in distress, bearing 270, approximately 2 miles. Aircraft appears to be on fire and descending rapidly. Stevens immediately turned towards Sarah's position and spotted the aircraft she was referring to. Roger, 1-1. I see him. Looks like a Cessna, probably a training flight from the civilian airport. He's going down fast. The civilian aircraft was indeed a Cessna 152, flown by a student pilot on his first solo cross-country flight. Engine failure had led to an in-flight fire, and the young pilot was fighting to control the aircraft while looking for a place to land in the hostile desert terrain below. Tower, this is Warthog 1-1. Sarah called to air traffic control. We have a civilian aircraft in emergency descent, requesting permission to break off demonstration and provide assistance. There was a pause as the air traffic controller consulted with his supervisor. This was not a situation covered in the standard operating procedures for airbase demonstrations. Finally, the response came back. Warthog 1-1, you are cleared to break off demonstration and render assistance. Emergency services are being notified. On the observation deck, the delegation watched in fascination as the 2 military aircraft banked sharply away from their demonstration area and headed toward what was clearly an emergency situation. General Harrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of watching his carefully orchestrated demonstration turn into something completely unexpected. Sarah pushed the A-10 to its maximum speed as she headed toward the distressed civilian aircraft. At 450 knots, the Warthog was not particularly fast by modern standards, but it was fast enough to quickly close the distance to the Cessna. As she approached, she could see that the small plane was indeed on fire, with flames visible around the engine compartment. Cessna in distress, this is Air Force Warthog 1-1. Sarah called on the emergency frequency. Do you copy? The response was immediate and filled with panic. Warthog, this is Cessna 94 Charlie. Engine fire, losing power, looking for emergency landing site. Sarah looked down at the desert terrain below. It was rough, rocky, and completely unsuitable for an emergency landing by a small aircraft. The Cessna pilot would need to find better terrain quickly, or the emergency landing would likely be fatal. Cessna 94 Charlie, I have you in sight, Sarah replied, maneuvering the A-10 to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. There's a dirt road about 2 miles to your north-northeast. Can you make it that far? I don't know, came the panicked reply. Controls are getting sluggish. Fire is spreading. Sarah realized that the civilian pilot was becoming overwhelmed by the emergency. This was a student pilot on his first solo cross-country, probably with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. He needed calm, clear guidance to survive the next few minutes. Cessna 94 Charlie, listen to me carefully, Sarah said, her voice calm and authoritative despite the urgency of the situation. You can do this. I'm going to guide you to a landing site. Turn left heading 030 right now. The Cessna slowly began to turn, the pilot following Sarah's instructions. She could see that the aircraft was losing altitude quickly, and the flames seemed to be getting worse. Time was running out. Flying slightly ahead and to the right of the civilian aircraft, Sarah began scanning the terrain for the best possible landing site. The dirt road she had spotted was straight and relatively smooth, but it was still going to be a challenging landing for an inexperienced pilot in a damaged aircraft. Cessna 94 Charlie, I have the road in sight, Sarah radioed. It's directly ahead of you, about 1 mile. Start your approach now, and remember to keep your airspeed up until you're committed to landing. Roger, I see the road, the civilian pilot replied, his voice still shaky but more focused. Beginning approach. Sarah positioned the A-10 slightly behind and to the side of the Cessna, giving her the best view of the approach while staying clear of the landing area. She watched as the small plane lined up with the dirt road, fighting wind and the effects of the engine fire. The approach was rough but manageable until the final moments. About 50 feet above the ground, the Cessna's engine finally seized completely, killing all remaining power. The aircraft dropped like a stone, hitting the dirt road hard but staying upright. He's down, Sarah called to Stevens, who was circling overhead. Cessna 94 Charlie is down on the dirt road. Aircraft appears intact, but still burning. Sarah immediately began circling the crash site, looking for signs of life from the pilot and providing overhead surveillance until emergency responders could arrive. Through her binoculars, she could see the pilot climbing out of the aircraft and moving away from the flames, apparently uninjured. Warthog 1-1, this is 1-2, Stevens called. Outstanding job on the emergency assist. Rescue helicopters are en route. ETA 10 minutes. As Sarah continued to circle the crash site, she realized that something fundamental had changed. What had started as a demonstration flight designed to humiliate her had turned into a real-world rescue mission. She had used her training, her aircraft, and her judgment to help save someone's life. Back at the airfield, the congressional delegation was buzzing with excitement about what they had just witnessed. This was not the sterile, choreographed demonstration they had expected, but a real-world example of Air Force capabilities being used to save lives. General, Congressman Thompson said to Harrison, that was absolutely extraordinary. Captain Mitchell showed exactly the kind of judgment and flying ability we need in our military pilots. General Harrison found himself in the awkward position of agreeing with praise for a pilot he had tried to set up for failure. Yes, he said stiffly. Captain Mitchell performed adequately. But even as he spoke, Harrison knew that his position was becoming untenable. The woman he had tried to humiliate had just demonstrated superior flying skills and judgment in front of the most important audience possible. Whatever his personal feelings about women in combat roles, he could no longer deny that at least this particular woman had proven herself worthy of respect. 10 minutes later, the rescue helicopter arrived at the crash site and confirmed that the civilian pilot was uninjured. The Cessna was a total loss, but thanks to Sarah's quick thinking and skilled guidance, a young man would be going home to his family that night instead of becoming a statistic. As Sarah finally turned the A-10 back toward the airfield, she reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. She had taken off expecting to fly a simple demonstration, hoping to prove that she belonged in a combat aircraft. Instead, she had found herself managing a real emergency and helping to save a life. The landing back at Davis-Monthan was smooth and professional, with both A-10s touching down within seconds of each other on the parallel runways. As Sarah taxied back to the flight line, she could see crowds of people waiting for her return. The delegation, the media, base personnel, and her fellow pilots were all gathered to witness the conclusion of what had become an extraordinary day. As she shut down the engines and began her post-flight procedures, Sarah knew that whatever happened next, she had proven something important to herself and to others. She belonged in this cockpit, and she had the skills to use this aircraft for its intended purpose, protecting and serving others. But the real test was yet to come. As she prepared to face the crowd waiting on the tarmac, Sarah had no idea that the events of the day would spark a controversy that would reach the highest levels of the Pentagon and change military aviation policy forever. The crowd gathered on the tarmac was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen after a routine flight. As she climbed down from the A-10's cockpit, removing her helmet and running her fingers through her sweat-dampened hair, she found herself facing a sea of expectant faces. Camera crews jockeyed for position. Congressional staffers whispered urgently into their phones, and fellow pilots watched with expressions ranging from admiration to bewilderment. Senator Patricia Hawkins was the first to reach her, striding across the tarmac with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. A former prosecutor before entering politics, Hawkins had built her reputation on asking tough questions and demanding straight answers. But as she approached Sarah, her expression was one of genuine admiration. "Captain Mitchell," Hawkins said, extending her hand. "That was absolutely remarkable. In 30 years of observing military operations, I've rarely seen such a combination of skill, judgment, and grace under pressure." Sarah accepted the handshake, still processing the surreal nature of the situation. 6 hours ago, she had been flying routine transport missions. Now she was being congratulated by a United States senator for what had essentially been her first real test as a combat pilot. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, maintaining military courtesy despite the chaos surrounding them. "I was just doing my job." "Nonsense," interjected Congressman Thompson, who had approached during the exchange. "What you did up there went far beyond just doing your job. You demonstrated exactly the kind of multitasking, decision-making, and flying ability that our combat pilots need. The fact that you did it in an aircraft you'd never flown before makes it even more impressive." From across the tarmac, General Harrison watched the scene with growing discomfort. What was supposed to have been a quiet demonstration followed by a brief meet and greet had turned into an impromptu press conference with Sarah as the center of attention. Every question, every compliment, every expression of amazement was driving home the point that his joke had backfired spectacularly. Master Sergeant Torres appeared at Sarah's elbow, carrying her flight gear and wearing a grin that threatened to split his weathered face in half. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've been working on these birds for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone take to the warthog like that on their first flight. That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed." The praise from Torres meant more to Sarah than all the congressional accolades combined. He was a man who had seen hundreds of pilots fly the A-10, who understood better than anyone what the aircraft demanded from its pilots. His approval carried the weight of expertise and experience. But even as Sarah basked in the positive reception, she could sense undercurrents of tension. Not everyone present was pleased with how the day had unfolded. She caught sight of several senior officers engaged in heated conversations near the hangar, their body language suggesting significant disagreement about what had just occurred. The media attention was particularly intense. Sarah had not expected to find herself facing television cameras and newspaper reporters, and she struggled to maintain her composure as questions came rapid-fire from multiple directions. "Captain Mitchell, how did it feel to fly a combat aircraft for the first time?" called out a reporter from Aviation Week. "What was going through your mind when you spotted the civilian aircraft in distress?" asked another from the local television station. "Do you think this demonstrates that women are ready for combat flying roles?" pressed a third from a national news network. That last question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that, however she answered, it would likely be quoted and analyzed by military personnel, politicians, and gender equality advocates across the country. The weight of representation that she had felt earlier was nothing compared to what she faced now. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that this demonstrates that pilots should be evaluated based on their ability, training, and judgment, regardless of any other factors. The A-10 doesn't care whether its pilot is male or female. It only cares whether that pilot has the skills to operate it safely and effectively." It was a diplomatic answer, but it satisfied neither the reporters nor the various factions watching from the crowd. Sarah could see General Harrison's jaw tighten as her words implied criticism of policies that had kept women out of combat roles. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stepped forward, his presence causing the crowd to quiet slightly. As the squadron commander, his words would carry significant weight in how the day's events were interpreted and reported. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patterson announced, "Captain Mitchell has just completed one of the most impressive demonstration flights in this squadron's history. Her handling of both the planned demonstration and the emergency situation showed exactly the kind of professionalism and skill that the Air Force expects from all our pilots." Patterson's endorsement was significant because it came from a respected officer with no apparent political agenda. Unlike General Harrison, who was known for his traditional views, Patterson was viewed as a straight shooter who cared more about competence than politics. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself approached by Captain Stevens, her wingman during the flight. Stevens was a quiet professional with over 1,500 hours in the A-10, and his opinion mattered enormously within the pilot community. "That was outstanding flying," Stevens said simply. "I've seen a lot of pilots transition into the Warthog, and you handled it better than most with 50 times your experience in type." "I had a good instructor on the ground," Sarah replied, nodding toward Torres. "And excellent backup in the air." Stevens smiled. "Don't sell yourself short. What you did up there with that civilian aircraft was pure pilot instinct. You can't teach that kind of situational awareness and decision-making. You either have it or you don't, and you definitely have it." But not everyone on the base was pleased with the day's developments. As word of Sarah's successful flight spread throughout Davis-Monthan, reactions were decidedly mixed. In the officers' club that evening, heated discussions broke out between those who saw her performance as proof that women belonged in combat roles, and those who viewed it as an isolated incident that shouldn't influence broader policy. Major Frank Richardson, a veteran F-16 pilot with strong opinions about military traditions, was particularly vocal in his criticism. "One good flight doesn't prove anything," he argued to a group of fellow pilots. "Combat is different from a training demonstration. She's never been shot at, never had to operate under real combat stress. This was just a publicity stunt that got out of hand." His comments were overheard by several other officers, including some who had witnessed Sarah's performance firsthand. The debate that followed became increasingly heated, reflecting broader tensions within the military about changing roles for women in combat. Meanwhile, in General Harrison's office, a very different conversation was taking place. The general had been summoned to a secure phone call with Pentagon officials who had received preliminary reports about the day's events. The call had not gone well. "Bob," said General Margaret Foster, Harrison's superior at Air Combat Command, "I'm getting reports that suggest today's demonstration was designed to embarrass Captain Mitchell rather than showcase our capabilities. Please tell me that's not accurate." Harrison found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't deny the truth without lying to a superior officer, but admitting his intentions would end his career. "Ma'am, I selected Captain Mitchell because she had requested more challenging assignments. I thought the demonstration would be a good opportunity for her to show her capabilities." "That's an interesting interpretation," General Foster replied dryly. "Because the reports I'm getting suggest that you assigned a pilot with 0 hours in type to fly a congressional demonstration with 4 hours notice, expecting her to fail and prove some point about women in combat roles." The silence that followed was deafening. General Foster continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "If that's accurate, Bob, then you've just created the exact opposite of what you intended. Captain Mitchell's performance today has become a textbook example of why women should be allowed in combat roles. Congress is already asking questions about our current policies." After the call ended, Harrison sat alone in his office, staring at the wall covered with commendations and photos from his 30-year career. He had never questioned his beliefs about women in combat, had never considered that his assumptions might be wrong. But the day's events had forced him to confront the possibility that competence and courage had nothing to do with gender. Meanwhile, Sarah was experiencing her own moment of reflection in her quarters. The excitement of the day was wearing off, replaced by the sobering realization that her life had changed dramatically. She was no longer just another transport pilot hoping for better assignments. She had become a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. The phone in her room rang, startling her from her thoughts. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Captain Mitchell, this is Colonel James Sullivan from the Pentagon. I'm calling to inform you that your performance today has attracted significant attention at the highest levels of the Air Force. I need you to report to Washington, D.C. for a briefing tomorrow morning." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. A summons to the Pentagon could mean either career advancement or career termination, and she had no way of knowing which. "Yes, sir. May I ask what this briefing concerns?" "Let's just say that your demonstration flight today has raised some important questions about our current policies regarding women in combat roles. Your input will be valuable in helping us determine the best path forward." After hanging up, Sarah realized that the day's events had set in motion forces much larger than herself. The congressional delegation had returned to Washington with first-hand evidence that challenged existing military policies. The media coverage was already sparking national debates about gender equality in the armed forces. And somewhere in the Pentagon, senior officers were questioning assumptions that had guided military policy for decades. The knock on her door came at 0600 hours the next morning. Master Sergeant Torres stood in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of concern. "Ma'am," he said, "I heard about your orders to Washington. I wanted to make sure you understood something before you left." Sarah invited him in, grateful for the familiar face and straightforward manner of the senior enlisted man. "What you did yesterday," Torres continued, "wasn't just good flying. It was the kind of flying that saves lives and wins wars. I don't care what the politicians and generals say about policies and traditions. In combat, the only thing that matters is competence, and you've got that in spades." "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "That means a lot." Torres nodded and turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Ma'am, there's something else. The crew chiefs have been talking, and we all agree on something. If this bird ever goes to war again, we'd be honored to have you flying her into combat." It was perhaps the highest compliment a pilot could receive from the enlisted personnel who maintained and prepared their aircraft. These were men and women whose lives depended on pilot competence, who had no patience for politics or social experimentation. Their approval was based purely on professional assessment of ability. As Sarah prepared for her trip to Washington, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. She had started the previous morning as an obscure transport pilot fighting for recognition. She was ending it as a national figure whose performance had challenged fundamental assumptions about military service. The flight to Washington was surreal. Commercial passengers recognized her from the television coverage. Flight attendants offered congratulations, and she found herself signing autographs for young girls whose parents wanted them to meet a real female pilot. The attention was overwhelming and slightly embarrassing, but also inspiring. At Reagan National Airport, a Pentagon staff car waited to transport her to meetings that would shape not only her own future, but potentially the future of women in military aviation. As the car wound through Washington traffic, Sarah gazed out at the monuments and government buildings that represented the power to change military policy. She thought about all the women who had served in the military before her, denied opportunities because of assumptions about their capabilities. She thought about the young girls who might now see military aviation as a possibility because of what had happened yesterday. And she thought about the responsibility that came with being a symbol of change. The Pentagon loomed ahead, its massive bulk representing both the power of the American military and the weight of tradition that resisted change. In a few hours, Sarah would face senior officers and politicians who would decide whether her performance had been an isolated incident or evidence of broader capabilities that had been overlooked. But as the staff car approached the Pentagon entrance, Sarah felt a calm confidence settle over her. Whatever happened in the meetings ahead, she had already proven something important to herself and to others. She belonged in that A-10 cockpit, and no amount of political maneuvering could change that fundamental truth. The security checkpoint guards recognized her immediately, their professional demeanor cracking into smiles as they processed her identification. Word of her visit had clearly spread throughout the Pentagon, and the reactions she saw suggested that her performance had resonated far beyond the airfield where it had taken place. As she walked through the corridors of American military power, Sarah realized that the joke General Harrison had intended was about to become something much more serious. The question was whether the Pentagon would embrace the change she represented or find ways to contain it within existing structures and assumptions. Either way, there would be no going back to the anonymous transport flights and routine assignments that had defined her career just days before. For better or worse, Sarah Mitchell had become the face of a debate that would reshape American military aviation. The Pentagon briefing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, but the presence of the individuals seated around the mahogany table more than compensated for the intimate setting. General Margaret Foster, the four-star commander of Air Combat Command, sat at the head of the table with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. To her right sat Admiral Jennifer Walsh, the Navy's first female admiral to command carrier operations, and to her left was General Robert Chun, the Air Force Chief of Staff. Also present were 3 members of Congress from the previous day's delegation, including Senator Hawkins, who had specifically requested to participate in the briefing. A handful of Pentagon policy analysts rounded out the group, their tablets and notepads ready to document what everyone understood would be a historic conversation. Sarah entered the room in her dress blue uniform, her ribbons and pilot wings catching the overhead lighting. Despite her nerves, she maintained the bearing and composure that had carried her through years of challenging situations. She had faced hostile instructors, mechanical emergencies, and career-threatening discrimination, but nothing had quite prepared her for this moment. "Captain Mitchell," General Foster said, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming to Washington on such short notice. Please have a seat." As Sarah settled into the chair across from the senior officers, she noticed that the atmosphere in the room was surprisingly informal. This didn't feel like a disciplinary hearing or even a formal briefing. Instead, it felt more like a strategy session among colleagues trying to solve a complex problem. "Captain," General Foster continued, "before we begin, I want to make something clear. You are not in any trouble, nor is your performance being questioned. Quite the opposite. Your demonstration flight has raised some important questions that we need to address, and your perspective will be invaluable in helping us find the right answers." Senator Hawkins leaned forward, her expression serious but supportive. "Captain Mitchell, I've been briefed on the circumstances surrounding your flight. Can you tell us, in your own words, how you came to be flying that A-10 demonstration?" Sarah took a breath and began to recount the events, starting with General Harrison's announcement in the briefing room and ending with her successful handling of the civilian aircraft emergency. She spoke clearly and factually, avoiding any editorial comments about motivations or intentions. When she finished, the room was quiet for several moments. Admiral Walsh was the first to speak. "Captain, I've reviewed the flight footage and spoken with several witnesses. What I'm curious about is your decision-making process when you spotted the civilian aircraft. You had several options available to you. Why did you choose to break off the demonstration and provide assistance?" It was clearly a test question, designed to probe Sarah's judgment and priorities. "Ma'am," Sarah replied, "the demonstration was important, but saving a life was more important. I felt confident that I could provide meaningful assistance to the civilian pilot while maintaining the safety of my own aircraft and crew." "Even though you had minimal experience in the A-10? General Chen asked. "Yes, sir. The skills needed to guide that civilian pilot were not specific to any particular aircraft. They were basic pilot skills that apply regardless of what you're flying. My lack of A-10 experience was irrelevant to that particular situation." General Foster nodded approvingly. "That shows exactly the kind of judgment we need from our combat pilots. The ability to prioritize, adapt, and execute under pressure are more important than any specific technical knowledge." The conversation continued for over an hour, with the senior officers asking detailed questions about Sarah's training, her experience, and her views on military aviation. But, gradually, the discussion shifted from her individual performance to broader policy questions. "Captain," Senator Hawkins said, "you must be aware that your demonstration has reignited the debate about women in combat roles. What are your thoughts on current restrictions?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had given considerable thought to her answer. "Ma'am, I believe that military assignments should be based on ability, training, and performance, not on assumptions about what any particular demographic can or cannot do." The A-10 responded to my inputs exactly the same way it would have responded to any other qualified pilot's inputs. But combat involves stresses and challenges that go beyond basic flying skills, General Chen pointed out. Physical demands, psychological pressure, the need to function effectively in life-or-death situations. "Yes, sir," Sarah agreed. "But those same stresses and challenges affect male pilots as well. Some handle them better than others, regardless of gender. I would suggest that the solution is better screening and training for everyone, not blanket exclusions based on demographics." Admiral Walsh smiled slightly. "Captain, you should know that your performance yesterday has already had practical effects. I've received calls from 3 different Navy commanders asking when they can expect to receive female pilots for combat squadrons. Your demonstration has convinced a lot of skeptics. But not everyone was convinced, as became apparent when the discussion turned to implementation challenges. One of the Pentagon analysts raised concerns about unit cohesion, physical facilities, and what he termed social dynamics in combat units. These are all legitimate concerns, General Foster acknowledged, but they're operational challenges, not insurmountable barriers. The military has successfully integrated before, and we can do it again if the will exists at the leadership level. The briefing continued for another 2 hours, covering everything from training protocols to career progression patterns for female combat pilots. Sarah found herself not just answering questions, but actively participating in policy discussions that would affect thousands of women for decades to come. As the meeting drew to a close, General Foster made an announcement that caught everyone by surprise. Captain Mitchell, based on your performance and the circumstances that brought you here, I'm directing that you be immediately transferred to the 355th Fighter Wing as an A-10 pilot. You'll undergo accelerated training to bring you current in all mission areas, after which you'll be assigned to a regular combat squadron. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This was beyond her wildest hopes just 3 days earlier. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. I'm confident you won't, General Foster replied. But that's not all. You're also being assigned as a liaison officer to a new Pentagon working group on gender integration in combat aviation. Your job will be to help develop policies and procedures that ensure we identify and utilize the best pilots available, regardless of gender. As the briefing concluded and participants began filing out of the room, Senator Hawkins approached Sarah with a final comment. Captain, you should know that Congress will be watching your progress very carefully. Your success will open doors for countless other women who want to serve their country in combat roles. But, equally important, it will help the military become more effective by utilizing all available talent. The flight back to Arizona gave Sarah time to process the magnitude of what had occurred. In less than a week, she had gone from flying routine transport missions to becoming the face of military aviation integration. The responsibility was daunting, but also exhilarating. When she arrived back at Davis-Monthan to collect her belongings and prepare for transfer to her new assignment, she found that news of her Pentagon meeting had already spread throughout the base. The reaction was mixed but generally positive, with many fellow pilots expressing admiration for her performance and excitement about her new role. Master Sergeant Torres was waiting for her at the A-10 hangar, where tail number 810965 sat gleaming under the maintenance lights. The aircraft that had launched her career transformation was being prepared for its next mission. Ma'am, Torres said, approaching with a small wrapped package. The crew chiefs wanted to give you something before you left. Sarah unwrapped the package to find a small piece of metal mounted on a wooden base. It was a fragment from an A-10 that had been damaged in combat, inscribed with the words, "To Captain Mitchell, from your Warthog family. Fly safe, fly proud." This is from Desert Storm, Torres explained. The aircraft brought its pilot home despite taking significant damage. We figured it was appropriate for someone who's going to help bring a lot more pilots home in the future. The gesture was deeply moving, representing acceptance from the community of professionals who would ultimately determine whether integration succeeded or failed. These were people who cared only about competence and character, and their approval meant everything. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Sarah encountered General Harrison in the base operations building. The general looked older than he had just a few days earlier, and his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I wanted to speak with you before you left." Sarah came to attention, uncertain what to expect. Harrison looked uncomfortable, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "What I did was wrong, both professionally and personally. I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment, and I tried to use you to prove a point that was itself based on false assumptions." Sarah was stunned. A public apology from a general officer to a captain was almost unprecedented in military culture. "Sir," she replied, "I appreciate your honesty. I hope that what happened will help the Air Force become more effective by utilizing all available talent." Harrison nodded slowly. You've already accomplished that, Captain. Your performance forced all of us to examine our assumptions about what makes a good combat pilot. That's a valuable lesson, even if it came at the cost of my own credibility. As Sarah prepared to leave Davis-Monthan for her new assignment, she reflected on how dramatically the trajectory of her career had changed. The general's joke had indeed had consequences, but not the ones he had intended. Instead of proving that women didn't belong in combat aircraft, the incident had demonstrated exactly the opposite. 6 months later, Sarah was flying regular A-10 missions as part of the 357th Fighter Squadron, having completed her transition training with distinction. She had also helped develop new policies that opened combat aviation roles to qualified women throughout the Air Force. The integration was not without challenges, but the success stories far outnumbered the problems. The civilian pilot she had helped save, a young man named David Chun, had written her a letter thanking her for her assistance and mentioning that the experience had inspired him to apply for Air Force pilot training himself. It was a reminder that her actions had ripple effects she might never fully understand. General Harrison, meanwhile, had taken early retirement after the incident, but not before implementing new policies designed to ensure that pilot assignments were based solely on merit and capability. His final act as a general officer was to recommend Sarah for promotion to major, citing her exceptional performance under pressure and outstanding contribution to Air Force effectiveness. The working group Sarah served on eventually produced recommendations that transformed military aviation training and assignment policies. The changes took years to fully implement, but they fundamentally altered the culture of combat aviation, creating opportunities for thousands of women who had previously been excluded from these roles. As Sarah sat in the cockpit of her A-10 during a training mission 2 years after that fateful demonstration flight, she thought about how a single moment of decision can change everything. General Harrison's attempt to embarrass her had instead launched a career that had exceeded her wildest dreams and opened doors for countless others. The Warthog responded to her control inputs with the same honest, predictable behavior it always had. The aircraft didn't care about politics or social change. It only cared about being flown skillfully and purposefully. In that sense, it had taught everyone an important lesson about the nature of competence and the irrelevance of prejudice. Looking out over the Arizona desert where her transformation had begun, Sarah smiled as she banked the A-10 toward the target range. She had work to do, lives to protect, and a legacy to build. The general's joke had become something much more important. Proof that excellence has no gender, courage comes in all forms, and sometimes the most profound changes begin with someone simply being given the chance to prove what they can do. The radio crackled with instructions from the range controller, and Sarah acknowledged with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through every challenge of the past 2 years. As she lined up for her attack run, she knew that somewhere a young girl was watching the news or reading a story about female military pilots and thinking that maybe, just maybe, she too could dream of flying combat aircraft for her country. That possibility made every struggle, every challenge, and every moment of doubt worthwhile. The general had intended his assignment as a joke, but it had become something far more significant. A door to the future, opened one flight at a time.